Welcome, everybody. The topic for today is around this tension between strategy and agility, and it's come from conversations that I've been having with people, including people on the call, I'm sure, who've talked to me about, in a leadership role, having to hold, and that's the phrase that I'm constantly, often with the hand movements, having to hold so much ambiguity, because I need my team to be able to focus on doing what they're doing, but there's so much that needs to change. And how do I manage that? How do I create an organization that's agile enough to adapt to this constant flux of stuff outside, but at the same time give people the kind of clarity and, I guess, confidence and reassurance that they need so that they can get on with stuff and not be distracted. So that's the context. And part of me thinks that's a sort of false dichotomy, that there is a better way. So I'm going to share with you what I think that better way might be. And you will all tell me why that's just crazy pie in the sky. But I'll start sort of way back from the beginning, about, I guess, how we've got where we are. Some of you, regular viewers may have seen some of the little bits that I'm going to share before, but hopefully this sort of narrative puts more of it into context. So I'm going to start with, just very briefly, the history of strategic planning, before you all fall asleep. So the whole model that we've got comes from the 50s and 60s and 70s. It sort of emerged from, Frederick Winslow Taylor and Peter Drucker and that whole sort of, series of people building on each other. But the environments that they all worked in were all sort of big mega corporations, people like Ford and General Electric and that sort of thing, where they played in very, very static markets. It was very sort of, the business model was competitive. And you could kind of, look back at the last 5 years trends and predict the next 5 years. And it was the kind of tools that we have, like SWOT analyses and PESTEL and that sort of thing, they were designed for those contexts. And the whole concept of a 5-year plan was really designed because, if you're building a car factory, you need to be thinking 5 years ahead. Whereas we're not those kind of organizations. None of us are. We're all kind of medium sized, some maybe 5 million, some maybe 150 million, but that's the kind of ballpark that we're at. And some of us work in competitive environments, but more broadly, we work in a collaborative sector where we know we have to partner and work together. And we don't work in a static, steady market anymore. The pace of change, we all know this. You look back at what you thought was going to happen 3-4 years ago and what has actually happened, and it couldn't be more different. So this sort of inherited model that we have, that we budget annually and that we create a 3 to 5 year strategy and that we lock these things in, we have strategic planning, which is, a plan that runs for a long time. These are all artifacts of a bygone age that have become embedded in the way that we think about these things. And so my mission really is to persuade you to unlearn all of that and just start with what it is that we need as organizations. And they are not those sort of things. And there is so that's your kind of strategy context. And then you've got your agility context, which again is kind of confused and historic. It comes from back in the day, about 30 years ago. My degree was in computer science, and we learned how to develop computer systems. And you went around and you spoke to everybody, and you did loads of analysis, and you drew rich pictures, and then you got technicians, and you built your architecture. And then 3 or 4 years later, you would go, ta-da! Here's your new system. And we all know that, this is what's brought down the government and the post office and various other different, megalithic organizations, because it's just a really ineffective way, particularly when you're doing anything at scale, of building software. So the Agile movement began, which was about prototyping and putting stuff in front of people with the recognition that as soon as you build a system and people start to use it, they kind of change what they want, because they start to play with it. And usually if it takes you 2-3 years to build it anyway, what they want has changed anyway, because the context has changed. So this whole sort of agile movement was around, we get a prototype and then we change it and then we adapt it and then we change it. And it feels kind of messy, but a whole load of structures and governance support, you know, some of you will know this because you'll have adapted those, or maybe you work in systems, but if not, you'll have adapted those same sort of principles of scrums, sprints, the constant review, not just of your progress, but of whether this is even the right plan, whether this is even the right project, whether we are even the right team, you know, whether we should even be having these sort of reviews and scrums. All of that is sort of, you know, regularly in the mix. And it's a much more adaptive way of working. And that was very, very successful in IT. And so people started to adapt it, to use it elsewhere, to use it particularly in the kind of entrepreneurial space. So you got people like, probably one of the books I've recommended most to people in the sector is The Lean Startup by Eric Rice, which is based on, you know, a lot of work. There's a whole community of them, people like Steve Blank, which was basically adapting that sort of whole agile methodology to startups and to, you know, this sort of methodology that if you listen to me ever talk about commercial income development and earning income and creating new ideas and innovation in that space, you will have heard me talk through that same sort of methodology, which is all about prototyping and testing, but with products and services rather than software and user interfaces. So, but since then, that kind of concept of agile has become a bit of a label. You know, we'll do sprints for this and sprints for that, to the point where quite often I'll kind of see stuff and people will talk to me, you know, we're going to do this in a really agile way, and it's almost like lost its meaning. But that's the heritage. That's where it comes from. So when we talk about, you know, how can we be strategic and planned, and at the same time be really agile and adaptive? That's sort of the linguistics. That's where they come from, and where they meet, I think, is in the place where we find ourselves normally when we actually do a strategy development project, particularly if you're thinking in sort of more modern sort of ways through it. So what we tend to find is you get to the end of a strategy project and there is some stuff that you're going to continue to do that you know how to do, and that stuff you can plan. But then there's a whole lot of new stuff that you don't really know how to do, or you know, you want to explore to see if there is something there, and that tends to be much more agile. So inevitably you come up with a strategy which is a kind of hybrid of these things. The reason I'm explaining that is because when you think about this tension through a strategy process, generally you kind of create that, and we find ways to manage it. So if we start to unpick how that works, that will help us when we think about more holistically, how do you lead an organization that needs to be sort of planned and strategic, but at the same time needs to be agile. So I will show you two things that I really like, the little visuals, just to sort of help set the scene on this. And I'd really like you to start thinking about your questions. I'm going to open up my little chat window. So if you've got any, you want to stick them in the chat as we go. Questions, observations, reflections on how or whether any of this so far sort of resonates for you. So let me share this. Some of you may have seen this before. This is a quote from Mark Zuckerberg. He was kind of like, you know, the Prince of Agile when Agile was in. It was sort of, you know, fully embrace it, do it everywhere. This was the mantra, launched in 2009 at some big conference. Move fast and break things. Unless you're breaking stuff, you're not moving fast enough. If you were there at the time, people put this on T-shirts. It was, you know, move, not the whole thing, the move fast and break things. It was like the Silicon Valley mantra. And that ran in Facebook as the core philosophy of the organization. And that's the reason why Facebook is what it is. I don't think they ever had a plan to, you know, to create an architecture for misinformation and conspiracy theories and all the sort of stuff. That just emerged because they worked in a very agile way. But all they were driven by was, you know, how long can we keep people using our site? You know, what is the dwell time and how many clicks? You know, that's those KPIs were all that they were driven by, and everything else fell from there. But then you fast forward to 2014, by which time Facebook, having been really agile and moved fast and break things, is now crumbling because none of the software talks to itself. You know, you've got loads of people that are constantly developing things and breaking stuff. Advertisers are starting to pull out because the platform's so unstable. So he launches this, and he said himself on the stage, yeah, I know it's not quite as catchy, but move fast with stable infrastructure was the way that Facebook finally recognized that you need to have these different speeds, almost these different models of work going on within an organization, stuff which is stable and stuff which is planned, and stuff around it which is very agile. You can't have a totally agile organization because it would be chaos. So they started at this point to really recognize that. And the metaphor that I've often used around this is the human body. To start with, at least anyway, you think about the skeleton is the rigidity. That's the stuff that's your infrastructure. That's the planned stuff. And the muscles, that's all the flexible stuff. And you need both, although, as one of my clients pointed out, not if you're an octopus, but I'm going to ignore that. Generally, you need both. There's one other thing that I wanted to share, and this, I think, speaks to the heart of the matter in terms of, what this means for organization, culture, and people, is this. And again, forgive me if I've shared this with you before, but I think it's just so relevant. This Eddie Obeng wrote a book, God, it's going back now, probably 1990s, called Project Manager's Secret Handbook, or I think it was All Change, Project Manager's Secret Handbook. But the most valuable thing that I think that was in that book was this description of different types of projects. I'd speak to people probably once a week about this to help explain why they're struggling with certain things. I use this metaphor, and it's usually really helpful. That we tend to think about projects, and by extension, strategic plans, as this type of project. You kind of top right. Paint by numbers is what OBENG calls it. I talk about it as, tab A, slot B, which basically means you are really clear on how you're going to do something, and you're really clear on what the end deliverable is. And we're taught this, when we learn project management, the first thing it's always, you can't start a project until you've got really clear objectives and you've worked out a really clear step-by-step plan. That's how we do projects. And what Obeng observed is that that's how we do certain types of projects, because they lend themselves to that methodology. And it's great. If you're McDonald's and you're rolling out new McDonald's, you know exactly what it's going to look like, you know exactly how to do it. You can stamp one out a week, probably one out a day these days. But there are other types of projects. There are types of projects where you know what you're trying to get at the end of it, but you're really not sure how you're going to get there. And I use Edison's light bulb as an example of that. There's a lot of experimentation. You've got this sort of KPI in your head. For him, it is, it can give out an awful lot of light and doesn't blow itself in 3 seconds. That's your sort of magic. And you're just kind of iterating to try and find different combinations, different ways to make that work. This is the Facebook type development model. We have these KPIs and we will just keep trying, testing, A/B testing and stuff until we get there. And you will have certain projects like that are quests. We know what we want. We don't know how to get there, but we know what we want. And we trust ourselves to be able to work it out along the way. We have other types of projects, which OBEM calls making a movie. I often use the metaphor of designing a library, so you are a city council, you want a new library. You don't know what it's going to look like, because that's part of the process. You don't know until, halfway, 2/3 of the way through and you finalize the designs, what you're actually going to get. But you do know how to do this, because people know how to do this because they've done it. Step one is you get, you put something out to tender. Step two is you whatever it is. So those are kind of making a move. And there are a number of types of processes that we use. Often a strategy process can fall into this box where we don't know the result, but we know how to do it. So we will get on and do it, and we'll trust in the process that the result comes out. And then you have this final one that OBENG calls fog, which is where this often happens in a sort of income development, income generation for a non-profit. We just feel really confident that there is an opportunity somewhere in this area that we can probably do something with our intellectual property for this kind of audience. What that looks like, what kind of model that will be, and even how we get from here to there, we don't really know, but it feels like an opportunity. So we're going to start to explore it. And so strategically, you will end up with bits of work, parts of your strategy that fall naturally into these different types of project model. They require different types of governance. They require different types of kind of attitude and skill set and capability in order to lead and run them. but this is what you should naturally end up with. So I'm going to sort of close that down. But if I sort of start with that context, the idea that you are then going to create this sort of, 3-year long monolithic plan that says A follows B follows C across all of this stuff seems really naive, in the fact that some of these you probably can't see more than 3 months ahead. You can plan your first few steps, but after that, you don't know, because that's the point of the first few steps, is to try and work out what's after it. Whereas other stuff, you can plan 3, 4, 5 years. If you're doing a complete brand refresh and launching a whole legacy development program, you're in it for the long haul on those types of things. So you are going to have longer term plans. So in a modern strategy in itself, you should have this sort of heterogeneity of different time horizons within it, and of different project types within it. So within if you do your strategy in a sort of enlightened way and just accept what it tells you your organization needs to become, and therefore the kind of things that it needs to start to build and explore, you will naturally end up with a load of stuff that within it has areas of solidity and areas of ambiguity. And therefore, what does that mean as a leader about holding all this ambiguity? What it suggests to me is that you shouldn't need to be in that situation. You should be able to find a way of conveying these things to your organization in a strategic context that they understand. And I know that that sounds like it's really easy for me to say in my ivory tower. You're not sitting there, trying to run an organization with all this stuff flying at you. But in terms of how so I'm going to come back to the strategy process for a minute and just think about two things. And one is flexibility. So we know, and many of you are in this situation, I know this because you've spoken to me about it, that we have big ambitions. We used COVID to really sort of reset and think about our role and our purpose and what we're here for. And other areas like influencing and getting on national agendas and that sort of, they're all now part of our thinking partnerships, all big parts of it. But we're now looking at a fundraising landscape that's looking really dodgy. We're looking at kind of investment that we want to do that's going to be really tight. We're looking at reserves and thresholds that we may end up getting very, very close to. How do we hold our nerve through this? And the simplest, and I think probably still the most effective approach, is to again go back to your strategy and think about all of these things as being building blocks. I think I've spoken to a few of you before about this idea of what is the difference between a sort of strategy and a plan. And a strategy is, well, a plan. A plan tends to start with where you are now and builds forward incrementally, stepwise. So historically, when you ask somebody for a 5-year plan, they would do a 1-year plan and then just extend it by another 4 years, and it continues on the same trajectory. And it tends to be about fixing today's problems and building on to today's successes. Ideally, strategy is different. Strategy starts from a point in the future, a dream of what you want to become, and then ask the question, what would need to be true? How could we possibly get there? And out of that start to form things like building blocks that I would describe. I'm not entirely sure quite how we're going to solve all these things, but we're definitely going to need this. We're definitely going to have to sort out our CRM system. We're definitely going to have to build a brand profile in this area. We're definitely going to have to put roots down in Southern Europe, wherever it is. And these have become the core building blocks of your strategy around which the other things flex. And each of those can be treated as almost like a block on a slider that you can slide backwards or forwards in time. So some of these things you can slide back. If you're not quite ready organizationally or financially to do this, some of these things you can slide back. And one of the things that I always encourage people to do during the strategy process is to start to develop a model, a financial model of what's coming in and what's going out and how these things relate to each other, where your investments return and this sort of thing, so that you can literally do that in meetings, that you can change dates on things and you can see the impact on your numbers as it starts to flow through. Because those are the kind of tools that in a very sort of fluid environment, fluid context where it's unpredictable, those are the kind of tools that are incredibly helpful. And there's two ways. So even on your non-agile projects, even on your planned projects, there are two ways that you can bring in an awful lot of flexibility to those. One is around when do you start, and the other one is how compressed you make it. Because we all have assumptions around how long a project takes. And we all know that if we really wanted to do it faster, we could, but it would bring with it risks. It would bring with it more expense. And so those are the kind of tools that you've got to play with. So on that side, you've got the flexible timeline, even with fixed projects. And we can talk about, how do you manage that as a leader? How do you manage that as communication? How do you manage that as planning, recruiting, capacity building, and all that sort of thing? But all of those problems are soluble if you feel as though you need to move stuff in order to manage the development of your organization through its strategic journey. So that's the one, is the timeline flex. The second one is the sort of adaptive type of flexibility that you get through using more sort of agile methodologies, and particularly through cascading stuff down through your teams. I know that there are at least one person on this call whose team, almost like the whole organization, runs on rolling 90-day plans and has learning reviews overnight, and people make their own decisions in a really delegated way, very, very empowered all the way down through the organization. But that gives you another degree of adaptability and flexibility, is empower people with what is we trying to achieve. You guys work out how, work on short time plans. Here's your envelope of limitations, in a sense. These are the places that you can't go beyond, whether it's budget or whether it's principles or whether it's whatever it is. So that's a sort of second area, is the adaptive flex. And then the third one, particularly when you're going through more sort of strategic thinking, is the scenarios. So those of you who've done scenarios, whether you've done it with me or whether you've done somebody else, I always encourage you to think about, what are the plausible extremes that could happen. So if your strategic thinking is looking out 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you'll be looking at what are the big trends and how extreme could they potentially become if they were combined. Because plausible extremes that's where scenarios need to sit. Everything else in the sort of less extreme space will still be answered by the solution to the plausible extreme. And these are fantastic exercises for your team, is, give 2 or 3 groups a plausible extreme scenario and get them to look at it and, imagine that in 2, 3 years time, this has happened. This is where you are. Number one, what will you do now in that situation 2, 3 years time when this has happened? But number two, more importantly, what do you wish you'd done? And what you tend to find is that you bring these 3 groups back, and they've all been looking at very different scenarios. 9 times out of 10, about 30 to 40% of what they bring back is consistent across all the groups. So these are the types of things that, again, they naturally form as strategic building blocks. These are what I think Bain called no regrets moves. So what you end up with through that process of building your strategy is you will end up with this sort of hybrid plan of stuff which is plannable because it's an extension of stuff you do and stuff you know, stuff which is exploratory, so therefore is going to work in a much more agile way, stuff which comes from your scenario thinking, which directs you towards these core building blocks of capability, but also towards these contingent actions that at certain triggers you might switch on. So this is the sort of richness of stuff which then forms the basis of your strategic plan, for want of a better word. It's these core pieces, it's these exploration pieces which will run on a much shorter, much more rapid and iterative timescale. It's these building blocks of stuff for the future which you know that you will need for whatever scenario, and to build that kind of core capability for the future. So again, you get to a place where you are managing an organization which needs to start to be comfortable with aspects of planned work and aspects of much more sort of ambiguous decision making as we go. So that brings us back to are you all sort of with me at this point? I'm not speaking too abstract. This is all relevant and real and useful. Yeah, excellent. I've got some nods, so that's good. That's good. One of these days I'm going to get a thumbs up. I'll be really, really chuffed. I've got one. Fantastic. Thank you both. So where do we go from there then, in terms of how do you engage this type of strategy and this type of thinking? And my first piece of advice for this is not to underestimate your people. There is a concept which you may be familiar with, which is called learned helplessness. And I see it loads in particular types of organization. You kind of see it as an undercurrent in lots of organizations in lots of places. But you see it most noticeably in organizations that have been sort of historically quite sort of founder-led, I suppose is the nice way of putting it. Autocratic is the other way of putting it, where you learn by experience within that culture remarkably quickly that you go up to get the answer. You don't try and solve it yourself, you go up, because if you try and solve it yourself, you'll probably get it wrong, and then you'll be in trouble. And you see all sorts of related behaviors when quite often that original founder, the more sort of autocratic style, exits and somebody else comes in with a perhaps more kind of consensual sort of empowering leadership style. One of the first problems that they hit is that they discover that their teams can't resolve their arguments. They're really immature in terms of conflict. I mean, immature as in, childish, but they just haven't developed that conflict maturity to be able to actually solve problems between them, because they've never had to. If you want to do one thing and I want to do another thing, we ask Dad. We don't actually try and work it out ourselves. So there's a whole load of stuff within an organization that you find that needs to be developed. And one of those things is working with ambiguity and sort of working across teams and making consensual decisions that are, genuinely collaborative rather than just some kind of trade-off. So we know, I certainly know from experience, that the ability to accept ambiguity and to empower responsibility down the organization to make decisions on the fly within certain parameters, we know that can be developed, because I've done it in organizations, and I'm sure you've done it in organizations. So the question is, how do you go about doing that within your organization in order so that you no longer have to hold all of this ambiguity yourself, but actually you can share it with your team? And why that's a good idea, you see when you start to do some of these exercises. So the ones that I kind of recommend, whether it's part of a strategy process or not, I think it's sort of irrelevant. But doing those scenarios exercises is really, really powerful. Doing things like De Bono's 6 hats is really, really powerful. If you've not done that, Google it, because it's a really good technique for helping people step out of their normal way of seeing the world into a space where things are not quite so black and white, or at least, not quite as they expect. Live role play is another one. It's one of I've recorded a testimonial with a couple of entrepreneurs, call them entrepreneurs. It's quite a big business these days, a few months ago. And I asked them while I was recording it, what was the one thing that you'd point to during the process? It was a team development process that we did that you got most out of. And they both immediately said on camera, it was great, that it was the scenario. It was the live sort of role play scenario that we did. And they make scented candles. They actually make these. This, believe it or not, they gave me this. This is a scented candle. It weighs a kilo. It costs an arm and a leg. It's unbelievable. That was my little treat for looking after them through it. But we kind of, big plans around launching brands and, shifting their business model and opening new countries. So we did a live role play exercise where I'd sort of quietly picked their brains over the previous 3 weeks and then put together. It's the sort of thing that you do on, the leadership recruitment type thing, where you get a lot of people, you shove them in a room and say, okay, here's the scenario. And I was stood there, it was one, I was described afterwards as like the Squid Games. So I would be saying, okay, so you just received an email and the factory in Barcelona is just burnt down. What do you do? But what it does, that not only is it sort of fun and it's exciting and it's interesting, and it does develop team bonding, it gives people a visceral sense of the genuine unpredictability of the world and how you have to shift into a more kind of thoughtful, solve the problems as they go type thing. In terms of raising people's comfort level with ambiguity, those types of, it's an experiential learning. So it's not learning as in, me telling you something or me saying, here's the reason why we need to do this. I'm not engaging with you at an intellectual level. I'm engaging you at a kind of visceral, emotional level of this. And at the end of those types of day, what tends to happen is you go away and you're a bit frazzled, and then you come back a few weeks later having reflected on it, saying, do you know what? I'd love to do that again. The teams always do that. But these are fantastic techniques, and there are more fantastic techniques for helping your people and your board and your trustees to just get two things really. One is much more comfortable with this sense of ambiguity, this sense of stuff will have to change, that we need to embed agile thinking and learning as we go into the organization. But at the same time, if you target it like that sort of example at something that's actually going to happen, or one of those plausible extreme scenarios, it gives people a content understanding as well. So they can start to think about, what the big contingent plans are, and at what point we might have to pull the plug on this because we can see, something nasty coming down the line. So it serves two purposes, sort of intellectual, but also sort of attitudinal. So those are the things that I would commend enormously to you. Now, I'm just going to pause there and demand, if I may, that you speak to me and just tell me how much of this you've seen, you've done, or you're interested in now that I've spoken about it. Shalanta, you're saving me. Thank you for coming in so quickly.
Oh, I just came off mute to think, but though I would say that as an organisation, our overall strategic process is quite rigid. And I think it's because we have got quite long-term capital developments, which sort of take 5-year sort of plans. And then we have probably not been agile enough in changing our approach to our more sort of what I would call enabling, influencing type activities that don't require that approach. And we're learning that. So I think that's when you come from an organization that started from its capital base, it sort of tends to apply quite heavyweight planning processes. So I would say that's where we've had to learn the more agile approach, of sort of test and learn. And I think also we don't have lots of unrestricted income. So that tends to bind you to sort of wanting to have more solidity because you're going out to ask for money to proceed with something. And therefore you've got less sort of money just swilling around with this kind of more agile process. You're actually having to give investors more assurances about longer term outcomes, etc. So I'm trying to explain why we are a bit crap at it, actually. So and I suppose there's no explanation for it there. It's recorded as well. But I'm talking about what I think are sort of some mental restrictions in terms of thinking in longer term timeframes, which have become from the organisation we were rooted as, and now moving much more to an online digital type organisation. So we need to learn some of those skills, but also the funding restrictions, funders requiring you to sort of give them assurances about outcomes and processes. So here's an idea, but I'm actually going to tell you how many people I'm going to deliver the service to or this activity to in 5 years' time. And I suppose that's about educating funders about also being more agile alongside you.
That is exactly right. Yeah, you're absolutely not alone. You're in the majority in the sense that the sort of rigidity of thinking comes from that sort of historic place. I have a client as a bank, you wouldn't believe it, and I've worked with clients in law, and it's the same kind of they all bring academics. Don't get me started on medics, but they all bring this sort of heritage from their own professions into their sort of expectations of how you can work and what risk tolerance they will accept and that sort of thing. And yours is just a great example because you come from an asset-based history, this idea of, well, that's the way that you plan as if everything is a 5-year construction job, and it isn't. And yeah, it takes a little while to unlearn, and it is an education piece internally and externally, as you just sort of said. Darren, share.
Hi Martin, evening everybody. So yeah, so much to resonate really. several things I've heard you talk about before, Martyn, and we've discussed before, but it's helpful bringing all this together. It's perfect timing for us because we're at the midpoint or approaching the midpoint of a 4-year strategy. So we'll be turning our attention in the next quarter to getting the momentum going. We start to think about the next one. I think for me, what's resonating the most is the need for a variation of approaches here rather than a one-size-fits-all, which I think is always really helpful to remember. So recognizing you need strategic elements, you need agile elements, you can't just do one or the other, and finding where they meet in the middle is key. The Eddie OBENG thing I love, and always used to have it pinned to my blue tack to the wall until it kept falling off and the blue tack perished. But then by then I've remembered it. That's always brilliant. Because it's not very often that a problem comes up or an idea comes up which doesn't fit into one of those. And that's a really helpful tool I found with the team. The point, and then 2 more points. One was around this pandemic, which sometimes feels like it was 5 minutes ago, and sometimes feels like it was 50 years ago, suddenly made us look at everything so completely differently and wondered whether the world would ever be the same again. And in some respects it is, some it isn't. And it's made us look to be, in some ways, more ambitious, but also more cautious as well. And that balancing of reserves and that being willing to try and do things differently and make a step change, but not put all the chips on the table at once and actually it either works or it doesn't. It's a really difficult balance to get, I think. And the timeline flex. So certainly me and my team have been guilty over the last couple of years with our strategy and business plan of treating all the different component parts as all or nothing. Either we do it like we said we were going to do it or we don't. Because if we don't do it like we said we were going to do it, it's not going to work. And we may as well not do it if we only do half of it. And you can't do that because you end up beating yourself up with stuff. So recognizing what you said about, well, what are the numbers behind all this? What's the finances looking like? And when do we need to ease off the accelerator? When do we actually need to stop and park something and then move one of the other pieces forward? So lots of really useful food for thought. Thank you.
A lot of this talk speaks to your governance models. I say sort of governance with a small g, I mean, kind of your internal governance around how you manage projects, you sort of oversight role as an executive team as much as trustees. But quite often the way that they're structured drives certain, but like this because you guys are sort of sitting there having to write board reports every couple of months or whatever. But it drives quite a lot of the cadence and sort of rhythms within the organization. And when those rhythms need to be different because you're working on an agile project rather than a planned project, it can be quite tricky. It is a big education job. It is about how do we put around, and some of you will one of these days I'm going to finish the sentence before I get distracted by the next thought, but some of you will remember this from during the pandemic, where I know a number of organizations did things like, rather than wait until the next board meeting, we're just going to put a committee of 2 or 3 trustees together so that we can just get really fast decisions on X, Y, and Z. You adapted, many of you had to adapt your governance and your oversight and everything quite significantly in order to manage the pace of change that you needed to work at. And that was really, really successful. And it's those same kind of changes that need to be adapted for doing the agile aspects of your work as well. Any other contributions, any other sort of reflections that you'd like to share? Louise?
Martyn, I was absolutely fascinated by OBENG. I've not seen that before, but it just absolutely talked to my organisation and some of the challenges that we've got at the moment. And I wondered whether there was something sector-wide, and I think having mentioned medics and academics, you may be giving me some comfort that actually the charity or not-for-profit sector has some of that learned helplessness. It is not just my organisation. And I've been thinking about how useful scenarios could potentially be. So I found it an absolutely fascinating session so far. Because there's a lot there that we are grappling with now as we are starting to think about how we transition to a new strategy. And everybody just wants a plan with start, middle and end, clearly defined. And I'm trying to work with colleagues to say that just isn't how it's going to be. So really timely.
Yeah, No, it's in my experience, and I'm sure you will all recognize this, it's never just you. It's never just your organization. It's usually, there's a lot of people that will nod when you say stuff like that. And it is that, how do you transition when your organization is so sort of almost culturally attached to a particular way of working, which is everything fits in that top right-hand box, whether it should fit in there or not, because that's how you do projects around here. And it is a real sort of cultural meme that gets embedded very, very strongly. And how you break out of that, it's different in different organizations. But again, for me, it's always a process. It's always, how do we take people on this process of education and experience in order for them to be able to look back and go, oh yeah, of course. Now I think about it, it's so crazy what we've been doing. And that's the point that you want to get to. And it's, what are the interventions that we're going to bring in order to get people to that place? Peter.
Hi, folks. Yeah, I'm Chief Executive for Money Advice Scotland. So we're an umbrella organisation that looks after money advisors, if you like. And I resonate with a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about there, Martyn, and sympathise somewhat with Louise there, with people wanting that plan, that long-term plan. And I just think it's virtually impossible. I had a meeting today looking at our risk analysis. And in there it's talking about, this risk over here will be mitigated by having a 3 to 5 year plan. But having a 3 to 5 year plan at the moment is a risk in itself, because everything changes so much. So this time last year, when we were coming out of just starting our funding round, we were really talking about COVID recovery, and a lot of the stuff that the Scottish government wanted from us was all about how are you going to tackle that, how are you going to meet that. And we just found that within 2 or 3 months, by the time we got to April, what's COVID recovery with the cost of living crisis and everything else was happening. So some of this stuff was actually, it wasn't necessarily forced on us. We did quite a bit of work in 2020 looking at what is our why to kind of build on some of Simon Sivonak's stuff that he's done. What was the core thing that we're here to do? So we were building a new strategy off the back of that and just really trying to hone into what we were doing. But we were under so much change last year as a result of the legislation coming in, trustonomics, lots of things had lots of impact on us as a charity because of the support that we're trying to provide to, I don't know, nearly 500 money advisors across Scotland now. All of that to say that one of the agility thing is great in being responsive, and that's been picked up by the Scottish government in our relationship with them as funders. But one of the things I'm picking up at the moment is exhaustion, because we're so used to working in a way that kind of we work through that, kind of have that really good, clear 2-year plan, objectives, all of that kind of setting. Well, it just gets thrown up in the air every 5 minutes. You've got to think again. So that stuff around scenarios and trying to do that. So we did a bit of that kind of coming out of the summer last year, just trying to think about what ifs and buts and everything else. But there are so many scenarios, Martyn, that I am finding that the team are great, and they're still doing that stuff and responding really, really well. We're holding our breath at the moment because we've just put in our application for funding, and if we don't get it, then it's going to shelve some of the stuff that we're doing. But off the back of that busyness, there's just a bit of tiredness there, I think, a bit of weariness of the constant change, because it is a very different model to what we've had to work with in the past.
It is, and it suits some people better than others. It's easier for some people to adapt. It's always a bit of a learning curve if you're habituated to working in a very planned way. It's always a bit of a learning curve, but some people can make that transition more easily than others. It's a personality type, I think, to a degree. I know it's impossible to generalize with things like autism, as Yolanta will know. But it is something to consider in terms of particularly people on the spectrum. The pace of change can be, there are aspects of that in all of us, some more than others. So those, there is a big consideration when you start to get into execution, and you start to understand that there are probably some parts of your strategy, some parts of your operation that are eminently plannable, or much more plannable than others, even if the timelines may have to slip or may have to compress. The certain people will naturally fit better into that type of work, and just understanding that can be quite helpful. But it's when you sort of step back, I'm going to come to James in a second, but it's just a really important point. When you step back, we talk, most of us, about wanting to become a learning organization, an organization that can try stuff and learn and get better and smarter and bring in information, build on its experience, understand its impact, and develop this learning organization. And that the predicate of that is that we will know more tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after, than we knew yesterday. And if you believe that, why on earth would you develop a 3-year plan that you then just execute? Because in a year's time, you'll know a hell of a lot more. And it goes back to this, sort of 50s, 60s, 20th century thinking, which is most of our people spend most of their time doing. That's manual work, it's turning lathes, it's making cars, or whatever it is. So we'll have this short little time where we'll do all the thinking, and then we can get back to doing. Your people generally aren't doers anymore. They're thinkers. They're knowledge workers, most of your people, most of the time, they're sort of skilled knowledge workers. So they are capable of, thinking. They're trained to think, to make decisions, etc. So why would we deny ourselves all of that capacity for sort of intelligent decision making by locking ourselves into a room once every 3 years and doing all the thinking, so that nobody has to think after that? You just do start, middle, and end. It's just when you sort of step back, I think that's a hard circle to square. I did say I'll go to James, and then I'll go to Petra. James.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm not sitting in a dark room, by the way. My camera is on, but Microsoft has just done a restart and a reboot of my laptop, and now my camera doesn't work. So phone the IT department tomorrow. But anyway, yes, I suppose maybe slightly similar to you, Peter, but maybe slightly different perspective. So I'm currently in a very new organization. So we are newly merged. I say newly merged. It feels like a long time ago, but I suppose within the last sort of couple of years we have merged. And this is our first almost ever strategy, merging two similar organizations together. Which is ASME UK and British Lung Foundation, so in that lung health space, but doing something very, very different. So we're in our first year of our new strategy. We are 1 year old today. We've had cake. It's lovely.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I would say again, sort of some of the things that are resonating with us, and to your points, Martyn, is that I guess we've built a 5-year strategy that is almost entirely in that quest phase. So we know what we want to kind of do, but we're very unsure what the plan is to get there, because we are very new as an organization. We haven't got a lot that we have necessarily carried over from the existing organizations, as it were. Yes, we still have things like helplines and information and advice, but it's all very different under a new brand and a new name. So I think as an organization, we have been, I suppose, very agile in terms of our delivery so far. And I think what people are absolutely crying out for now is just a little bit of more of the plan side of things, actually. I think we've almost gone the other way, where a lot of people are very much in the plan side of things and very little in the agile. We are very much in the agile space, and just people are crying out for okay, well, just give me a 2 or 3 year plan and tell me where the end point is and how to get there with all the steps. That would be lovely, because I can't keep taking all this not indecision, but this fog and this kind of quest, as it were. So and that's really tiring as well, I think, for a lot of people. So we're just slightly in that other space, I would say.
It is an interesting exercise, if you've ever decided to do it with your team, is to put that 4-box model up on the wall and say, where do you naturally feel comfortable? And quite often it's a bit of an eye-opener for, right, so that's why you work the way that you do. So Petra.
Thanks, Martyn. I think in contrast to James, my organisation is 70 years old, but last year we did develop our first strategy, and I'm relatively new to the organisation and trained by the best, Martyn, but I was very keen not to have a strategy that lay in place a series of activities that would be completed over the next 5 years. So we went through a very consultative process and ended up with a strategy that's really a framework with 2-year aims, 5-year ambitions, and it just grew out of all of the consultation. Kicked off in January. We've got our plan for this year, but the challenge is, what's in my head and what I see coming out of that strategy is translating that into a communication for people. And I think the OBERG is so useful because I can see aspects of our strategy that fit into each of the 4 quadrants. I think that can be a really powerful tool to help communicate through the organization what you're doing, and to have something that sits in the fog area is okay. And we have a wonderful fundraising initiative that's been kind of evolving over the last couple of years, and it's totally grown out of that fog area. And I've always felt a bit uncomfortable with it because I haven't been quite sure where I'm going, but it feels like the right thing to do. So it's a really good way of taking that kind of intuition that you've got that comes from the years of experience and putting it into a way of being able to then communicate it out to people. Likewise, we've got stuff that we do every day. It's very much in that paint by numbers area, and it's really clear. We know exactly the activities we're going to do. We know what we're going to deliver. Our KPIs are there, and it's so very different to the other areas. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us, and I shall be using that with the team as part of my kind of onward communication of what the strategy means, and certainly take you up on that idea of asking people where they feel most comfortable in that area, because I can actually look across my senior team and probably second guess where they might fall, but to actually be having that conversation and people understanding the differences that exist across the team, I think it's going to be a really useful exercise. So thanks very much for highlighting that.
You're welcome. I think a lot of the time just having a lexicon, just having a language to just describe these things can be really helpful. It gives you a framework to communicate with each other. And I'll come to Hock in a second, Hock. Just to sort of put some of this stuff into perspective. I'm just sort of slightly mindful of time. I will come to you, Hock. Keep your hand up, please. Put your hand up. But I just wanted to sort of, recap. So this is the kind of approach that I tend to take sort of strategically. I hope you can see that. There's sort of 5 strategy questions. Tell me if you can't. So what is the world that you want to see? That's your sort of external vision. What needs to change or exist for that to happen? That's your sort of theory of change or hypothesis, or that then dictates. So what is your role in bringing that change about? What are the roles that you can play, whether that's influencing or innovating? And what does your organization therefore need to become in order to play those roles? And therefore, what will your role be as a leader of that organization in the future in terms of the transition? And then just speaking to the piece that I guess, sort of leading towards there. How do you build this and communicate it? You tend to come out with that long-term vision, whether it might be 5 years or 10 years, as Petra was talking about. You tend to talk about a medium-term mission. So our role within the space for the next 5, our 5-year mission will be to X, Y, and Z, or, our ongoing mission. And stuff then comes out. And again, these sort of, it's the lexicon, the language around this stuff that we're going to scale up, the stuff that we're going to retain and deliver, the stuff that we're going to develop, there's areas that we're going to explore. So whether it's that kind of language, this is an exploration project, or this is a fog project, or whatever feels comfortable in your organization, but just to be able to define them, stick a label on it so people go, right. So that's why it doesn't have a plan. That's why we're really trusting somebody to just go there and try and make it happen. And you will have these kind of the bits, again, you can call these things what you want, but there's your sort of core financial model with your main things in it. There's the sort of flexible blocks of stuff within there that might slide back or slide forward or compress or elongate. And there's the agile development areas that probably have a little overlay in your finances of, risk, an envelope around what it could be and what it might be. And then from your scenarios, you'll probably have contingency plans and triggers that associate with it that people will understand. If it gets to this point, we will start to switch into this plan, which means that all bets are off on this project here. So that up front, that there's a chance that we might have to sort of stall this project at some point if this trigger happens. And I can't tell you the date, but I can tell you the signs that will make that happen or force that decision. So those are the kind of things that hopefully you come out with. And this is where I will come to Hock now. But just in terms of, what are the steps for doing this? I think firstly, resetting expectations on what strategy actually is, what it looks like, what it contains, the fabric of it. Secondly is refreshing your strategy just to accept that heterogeneous sort of hybrid nature, not try and force it into a box of this sort of monolithic plan. To redesign, it's inevitable that you will then have to redesign parts of your governance and your cadence of reviews. Your reviews will become much more frequent, certainly on aspects of your strategy, and then reassigning resources as appropriate. So who likes to work in what kind of environment, and can we make that match? And that then leads you almost by stealth through remodeling your culture towards that sort of empowerment, not hybrid working as in, remote and in person, but hybrid working as in you've got some people over here who are really planned and some people over here who are crazy sort of agile, but somehow those cultures coexist within an organization and they appreciate each other's different ways of working. So I'm going to stop that, but I wanted to just kind of land those so that you've got it and, you can watch the video and you can pick up that sort of thing. And I'll make the slides available afterwards. But there are there are ways and means to make landing this stuff easier, that you don't necessarily have to invent the wheel yourself. Hock, you've been so patient. Thank you so much for waiting. Do share.
That's all right. So much of this resonates with me. And, one bit that you mentioned in particular, Martyn, was about not underestimating our people, but also talking about learned helplessness in some ways, which, I can relate to both of those areas, because I'd love to not underestimate our people. But what I'm seeing is quite a lot of problems coming up the chain and being, leaders being asked to give the answer. And I'm just thinking about this particular time in which we're operating and the context in which we're operating, because I suppose the way that you give people confidence is to let them fly with some things, right? And show them that, we're behind them, they can take risks, and we would, support them whether they succeed or fail, and then learn and adapt, etc., etc. Right now, it's a really difficult operating environment. So take fundraising, for example. It's a pretty difficult environment in which to succeed right now. So I liked your phrase about holding your nerve, because I think as an executive team, that's one of the things that I've said. We need to, if we're going to invest, we need to be able to hold our nerve and see it through. But at the same time, I'm looking at our trustees and thinking, well, we've got to convince them to hold their nerve too. We're talking about reserves policies, and I did a exercise where we looked at plausible, extremes on the scenarios, and I presented a kind of low scenario through to a medium and a high scenario in terms of our income and all the things that we would do to manage within that range. So, despite talking to all of our people about a higher risk appetite, we've got extremely ambitious objectives for 2030, right? And we need our people to be taking greater risks and doing things differently. But right now, it's pretty difficult to kind of take that leap and hold our nerve. So I'm just curious about how others are dealing with that kind of dilemma at the moment.
That is a really good question. I have noticed that it is 6 o'clock. So I think that in somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks' time, when I organise the next one of these, I think I will pick that topic up, which is around that sort of what I guess I would describe that as organizational maturity, the development of people's confidence, independence, flexibility, but also of trust. And how do we develop, I guess, the sort of the leadership threads within the organization from bottom to top, rather than considering it as simply within the executive team. So I will try and find a way to summarize that topic in a really neat, pithy and compelling way. And I will send you all an invitation to come and join me again on some random Tuesday evening in 5 or 6 weeks' time. How does that sound? Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for sharing all of this. And hopefully I will see you all again in a month or so's time. Take care, everybody.